Jessica. That's right. We're here above Pennsylvania Avenue. In the last few minutes, we saw the motorcade head east from the White House to the U.S. Capitol, where in the next hour we do expect this inauguration, the oath to begin. Of course, lots of dignitaries in attendance. The parade route is already lined with heavily fortified reinforcements of security. I don't know if you can see it, but there are policemen lined up about every meter or so. Most of the protesters have been pushed back. We have seen dignitaries arrive. Hillary Clinton, of course, with her husband. A very difficult moment for her arriving here down Pennsylvania Avenue at the U.S. Capitol. She, of course, was planning on being here today in a very different role, but she is here as a former First Lady, along with her husband, the former president. That's right, Donald Trump's approval ratings taking office today at about 40%. Compare that to President Obama in 2009, his approval ratings 80%. And so a lot of what we may hear actually be Donald Trump's efforts to validate his election as the next president, to set a better tone of how he intends to go forward. One of the concerns that was raised during the campaign, raised, for example, by Hillary Clinton running against him, was if you can't trust him with the tweet, can you trust him, for example, with the nuclear codes? And we can assume that this morning at Blair House, as has been done with previous presidents, he was given the instructions by top military aides on how to launch a nuclear attack. And now going forward, he will always be followed by a military aide who is carrying a 20-kilo black satchel called the football that has all of the codes should Donald Trump need to launch a nuclear attack. And that, of course, has many people concerned, not just in the U.S., but around the world. We've heard Donald Trump, the candidate, speaking about possible nuclear arms race, encouraging other countries perhaps to take up nuclear arms. We heard him say that ISIL could, for example, be a possible target for a nuclear attack. So that has many people concerned, and we'll be listening closely to see how he intends to deliver on those tones. But the numbers, the 40% that I said earlier, probably reflects why the turnout has been low here. Something like 800,000 people expected. That's half of the amount of spectators who turned out for Barack Obama in 2009, and that really is setting a tone, and Donald Trump must be aware of that. Mike?
Let's check in with Roee Ruttenberg. Of course, the parade, a big part of this whole event, and it looks like a rather thin crowd there as well.
That's right. After the inauguration, there will be a luncheon with members of Congress and select guests, and then the parade route will begin. It's about 2 kilometers from the U.S. Capitol to the White House. But if we can just show you what the route currently looks like. It's a pretty thin crowd. Now, I'll admit, many of these people are actually watching the inauguration from big screens, but you would expect 2 hours before the parade would begin that these crowds would start filling up, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing a lot of security here, spread out about every meter or so. Security from 30,000 security personnel on hand here from 30 state, local, and federal agencies, and that's really a reflection of some of the concern that they have here about security. We will see what Donald Trump does during that parade route. President Jimmy Carter, who was on stage there as well, in attendance of the inauguration, he was the first president who decided to walk from the Capitol to the White House back in the late 1970s, sending a message that he intended to show that he is really less about the pomp and circumstance and more about being a president of the people. And we saw that tradition being kept up to some extent by some of the other presidents. Barack Obama famously got out of his motorcade against the advice of his security advisors and walked a good distance, I believe about 8 minutes. And we may see Donald Trump and his wife Melania try to do something similar to show themselves reaching out to the people here. That, of course, will happen in the parade route. And then later on in the evening, there will be a number of galas. I believe Donald Trump is scheduled to hold 3 galas. Compare that to the 10 that Barack Obama held when he was inaugurated. Donald Trump said this is a smaller affair. Again, the line that he's been using, so we can get to business right away. Mike?
Roee, give us a sense of the day ahead. The parade will happen a little later. Crowds still thin, or are they starting to build?
Well, the crowds here are starting to build behind me. The parade a bit more than an hour away, and we've seen people after the inauguration, the swearing-in ceremony, the oath, coming out here and starting to line the streets, people chanting Trump, 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 holding up their signs. Some protesters holding up signs, references words we won't use references to Donald Trump, obviously critics of the incoming president, as we see him there in those images having lunch now at the U.S. Capitol with members of Congress. Not all of them, we should note. Dozens of Democratic lawmakers have boycotted the inauguration. And interestingly enough, earlier we saw Nancy Pelosi standing to his left when he was signing those executive orders. She, of course, a Democratic House leader. Earlier in the day, at the actual swearing in, she was wearing a coat along with other Democratic lawmakers that had a button on it. I don't know if you saw the image, but it said very closely, "Protect Our Care," a hashtag that they're using. Let's listen into what's happening now at the lunch.
Roee, you were talking about Nancy Pelosi. She's there, but a number of Democratic lawmakers are not taking part, boycotting the event, including John Lewis, civil rights icon.
That's right, and that's drawing some criticism for their actions. Others saying they don't want to normalize what's happening here. And what I was trying to say earlier was Nancy Pelosi and other lawmakers who did attend decided to wear a pin that said "Protect Our Care," a hashtag that they're using to protect one of Obama's leading legacies from his presidency, which was the Affordable Health Care Act, or Obamacare has been known, which Republicans have vowed to repeal. And interestingly enough, I spoke to one White House official who told me that several of them are scrambling to try to get health care before that's repealed, now that they're out of jobs. From that luncheon, Donald Trump and his wife Melania and the Pences will travel to the White House. We have a map of that route if we can show it to you. It's about a 2-kilometer journey that starts at the U.S. Capitol, goes straight up Pennsylvania Avenue, iconic boulevard here in Washington, D.C., and directly to the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Interestingly, passing along the way at 1400 Pennsylvania Avenue, the new Trump Hotel, drawing, of course, a reference to Trump's business interests, which has been a sort of source of contention both during the campaign and since he won before taking office, of how he would deal with his business interests and business conflicts. A stark reminder of the Trump Hotel as they pass along it. And we'll, of course, be waiting to see if Trump and Melania, President Trump and his wife Melania, the First Lady, will get out of the motorcade and walk along the way. Lots of security here lined up, waiting for this parade to start in just about a little over an hour's time, and security on hand from some 30,000 security personnel from dozens of agencies waiting for this parade to start, a historic moment here in Washington, D.C. Mike, back to you.
Roee, we're hearing that some American networks are electing not to show these images.
Yeah, Mike, I was actually about to say that, but that just changed in the last 10 seconds, if you will. I'm actually here to give you an understanding of where I am at the museum, which is a museum dedicated to the spirit of journalism. It has the vantage point over Pennsylvania Avenue where the parade route is happening, and it is sort of a reminder of the confrontation that Donald Trump has had with the media over the last year, some good, some bad. He referred to outlets like CNN as fake news very recently in his press conference, and he and his supporters have often attacked liberal media. One of the things that's, I think, quite interesting is the moment Barack Obama took off on that Marine chopper here at the museum. They had a jumbo screen the entire morning. They were showing CNN, favorable to liberal, considered liberal media. The moment Barack Obama took off, the jumbo screen switched to Fox News, known for its support of Donald Trump, for support of Republicans, switched to Fox News, and that's all that's been showing. And just in the last minute, they have finally started showing pictures of the protests, which are happening just a few blocks away. And I think that contrast is quite interesting and perhaps helps explain to an international audience why there may be often two different realities in America. If much of red America, if it will, is not seeing the protests of blue America, they might not know about their frustrations. I also think that people in this blue America, if you will, who were listening to Donald Trump's speech, which was loaded with a lot of patriotic rhetoric, things that some people might say would be nationalist, and calls on promoting America over everything else, that may send a message that any sort of dissent won't be tolerated. When you have a candidate who suggests locking Hillary Clinton up, that's language that Donald Trump has now abandoned, but his supporters still use. When you have that kind of rhetoric suggesting that some who criticize America are actually un-American and they deserve perhaps to be punished, that creates a large divide. And what we're seeing, that divide is reflected in the media, which has really become quite partisan in recent years. And likely won't change anytime soon under Donald Trump. There have been some suggestions that he'll rarely hold press conferences, that he might be hostile to the press corps that follows him at the White House. We saw him as president-elect right after the inauguration, abandoning his press corps on a couple of occasions already. So people will closely be watching to see what type of relations he will have with the media, which many Americans consider to be the unofficial fourth branch of government. Mike?
This is a crucial spot. I'm right along the parade route, and I want to bring in my colleague, Roee Ruttenberg, who's been following the other end of the parade. Shortly, this is where the motorcade will come down Pennsylvania Avenue. Prime spot, Roee, for protesters to try to get their message heard and seen by the president. What else can we expect from the parade?
And these are really the protests that Donald Trump will see if he's looking. Unless he's watching TV or watching social media, he's not really seeing the other images that we've seen. But we imagine when he will come down here, he will see some of these signs, of course, here on Pennsylvania Avenue. This is the historic, significant boulevard here in Washington, D.C. It's a 2-kilometer journey from the Capitol building directly to the White House. And one of the things that I'll be looking for is to see if Donald Trump and his wife Melania will step out of the motorcade and walk amongst the people. This was a tradition started by Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s. Barack Obama was advised against doing it for security reasons. He did it anyway, and so we'll see, given the security concerns here, what's been happening, the fact that they've spent more than $100 million, it's estimated, on security, if his advisors will say, you know what, this is a time for you to get out.
And if he's going to get out along this parade route, this could be the spot where he wants to do it. Right behind us is the newly opened Trump Hotel, opened earlier. That's just been the scene of protests since it opened earlier in the year and in the days leading up to the inauguration. This could be a key spot. Also, you can see we're near some of these reviewing stands here, and we're not far from the White House, the end of the parade. So right here could be a crucial spot for Donald Trump as well as for the protesters.
And quite interesting and quite originally and unique is that it's passing by the Trump Hotel, which is, of course, a stark irony, a conflict of interest, as many have said, the fact that he has still business interests that many people wanted to see addressed just a few blocks away from the White House before the parade ends.
And a lot of the protesters we've been speaking here will take the same set of facts. The fact that he has a hotel, some people will say, look, this is a conflict of interest. Others will say this is a sign of his success. We want him to do for America what he did for his company. Mike, you were talking earlier about this divide in America. But speaking with protesters here and supporters of Donald Trump, I don't see any signs that this divide is going to end anytime soon.
Jim, give us a sense, because you've been out there all morning long. Has the crowd there at the parade route grown?
It has grown, especially in the last hour or so, but it's really not huge. I mean, it's lined along here, but there's plenty of space. Actually, we'll bring the camera around here a little bit and show you, Mike. So this is all area that could be filled by people watching the parade. Past events over the years, we've seen many, many more people than this. But as you can see, it's not a great day. It's hard to know what to make of crowd turnouts, but certainly not what authorities were expecting, not what security was ramped up for.
And we may remind our viewers that Ronald Reagan canceled his parade because of the weather, heavy snow. He actually held an indoor inauguration parade, if you will, as a substitute. This is not the type of weather we're seeing here. People have still come out to show their support, but not the type of numbers that we've seen for Barack Obama's inaugurations, twice as many back in 2009.
And Roee, as we see Hillary Clinton leave her luncheon, there really is a changing of the guard here in Washington. You can feel it in the street. I think there's a different mood here than there has been over the last few years with Barack Obama as president. What's your impression on that?
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to remember is that 90% of Washington, D.C. voted for Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump. So this is actually going to be quite hostile territory. A lot of the people who have come here to support him have come from outside of Washington, but they will leave when this is over, and the people who live here will stay. Barack Obama, as we know, will stay in Washington. He may sort of be an alternative shadow president or making comments he's indicated where he feels are necessary. And so we could see that divide being escalated by a President Barack Obama, former President Obama, still in town.
And one thing I've noticed here, talking with people on both sides, is how much uncertainty there is about what the next 100 days, the first 6 months of this new presidency of Donald Trump will mean exactly. Details have been hard to come by throughout the campaign. That's not unusual in a political campaign, but I think many candidates, by the time they get to swearing in, have more of a first 100-day plan, a checklist they want to do. So when we hear about things like repealing Obamacare, we still don't have details about what its replacement will look like. We hear about tariffs on goods from China, these new protectionist policies, but we don't know exactly how they'll play out. So uncertainty on both sides about what exactly Donald Trump presidency will look like.
And we could see Donald Trump encountering some resistance from members of Congress in the first 100 days, as you've mentioned. He is a Republican now. He hasn't always been. So we could see that sort of conflict on things, for example, from Democrats on efforts to protect Obamacare. We saw Nancy Pelosi wearing a Protect Our Care pin at the inauguration. One of the Democrats who were there, many choosing to boycott the event, of course.
And when you see images of the Clintons, Donald Trump throughout the campaign tried to paint the Clintons as part of this elite. He uses this phrase, drain the swamp, moving on from the establishment Washington. But yet we see in his cabinet nominees really a new kind of establishment, people from the business world and Washington insiders. So it's not clear exactly what drain the swamp means, what make America great again means, and how this will play out and what the details will be.
And his defenders will say that is the type of businessman he is. He makes his proposal, but it is negotiable. And then he starts adjusting. And we could actually see cabinet shifts as well during his administration. The original cabinet not staying the entire term and other people coming in. So lots of things to watch in the first coming few months.
So I'm going to bring in Roee Ruttenberg. Now you've been out in this crowd, Roee. What's your take on the mood with people here as we prepare to see Donald Trump come down Pennsylvania Avenue?
I think a few things are interesting. One, people are expecting to hopefully see him get out of the motorcade and actually greet the people. That's a tradition started by Jimmy Carter back in the 70s. It's something that other presidents have done in the past. And if that does happen, it'll happen likely behind us here in front of Trump's hotel, just a few blocks away from the White House, and we can hear the motorcade starting to approach. Interestingly enough, also along the parade route, the building next to it is the International Trade Center, and Donald Trump coming out largely against globalization, saying it's time to prioritize America's economy and put America first. Sort of a rather ironic building to pass in your last final few blocks towards the White House. We've seen some snipers up there at the top as well, a sense of the security situation here, $100 million spent securing the event here. That's really my sense of what we're watching, and most interestingly, I think, is when it's all over, what happens when these protesters meet each other in the street.
I'm going to bring in Roee Ruttenberg. Lots of pomp, lots of circumstances, lots of security. What's all this cost and who's paying?
Yeah, it's still early to say in the Trump administration. Trump officials said that they'll reveal those costs in the weeks following the inauguration, but it expected to top some $200 million. Now, more than half of that is just the cost of security alone. Some 30,000 personnel being brought in from around the country, from 30 or so different states, from federal, local, and state agencies, all to secure this event and the other events that go along with it, the inauguration, the parade, and of course the balls that are happening this evening. We know that there is as is always the case, a presidential inaugural committee that raises funds. The last number we saw from Donald Trump was around $90 million. That means the rest of the amount is being paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, by the federal government. That is tradition, but because of inflation and because of the type of security involved in this inauguration, the costs are really soaring, and we're seeing that with the type of security we've seen here.
Numbers in attendance have been lower than I think was expected by security people. That's made it a little easier to make this event manageable, but I think ultimately we have to say it speaks to the conflict around this new president. Tell us about the approval numbers that Donald Trump has on his first day in office.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the thin turnout here. We saw it earlier in the day. It's sort of filling up now, but not the type that we saw at previous inaugurations, particularly for President Barack Obama. Donald Trump going into office with something like a 40% approval rating. Compare that to Barack Obama in 2009, who stood at 80%. That's a reflection of what many Americans feel about Donald Trump, and also the insecurity that he offers to many people. One thing we should note, along the motorcade, Donald Trump is being trailed by a military aide carrying a 20-kilo satchel called the football, which contains the nuclear codes that were, it's assumed, given to him this morning. They will always follow him. If you recall Hillary Clinton tweeting during the campaign, if you can't trust him with a tweet, how can you trust him with the nuclear codes? That's part of the image that's here. We saw sort of official protests here, quite subdued with their signs, but we saw clashes elsewhere in Washington, D.C. And it's unlikely that President Trump saw those clashes unless he was watching on television or some advisor was telling him about those. We saw him go by here. As you mentioned, he got out of the car, a tradition started by President Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s. Carter's message was, I want to walk amongst the people. And actually, he tried to dispel the use of the song Hail to the Chief, which is the song that we just heard being played for Donald Trump there at the White House in the viewing stands. Interestingly enough, the evening also includes a commander-in-chief ball. Donald Trump now the commander-in-chief, and 2 other balls that Donald Trump and Melania are expected to attend. That's in comparison to the 9 balls that Barack Obama attended. Also, on Thursday night, there was what's called, we should point out, a deplorable, a reference to the term used by Hillary Clinton, deplorables, a basket of deplorables supporting Trump, largely alt-right, a group known as the alt-right, holding a ball to celebrate their views and what they consider to be their victory. This will continue. The parade's ending quite soon. This will continue through the balls, of course, and then this will also continue on Saturday.
Many of the protesters that we've seen out here and that we saw at security checkpoints trying to confront Donald Trump supporters, they will be out trying to follow the paths of people going to these balls tonight. They're all across Washington, D.C., so they'll be trying to get as close as they can. Be a bit of a cat and mouse game tonight with that. Tomorrow, a huge protest planned here. The crowd estimates at about 200,000 people for the Women's March on Washington. It's really the focus point of protests throughout this 3-day weekend, a 4-day weekend really, of activities around the inauguration.
And people you mentioned earlier, speaking to people from Florida, I know people from California, lots of women from around the country. We should point out not just women, but also supporters of women's rights. And a lot of this stems from what many women felt were Donald Trump's anti-women stances during the campaign, not just because he ran against a woman, but because of some of his comments now and in the past, and we'll likely see a very large protest on Saturday morning.
And I feel that a lot of these protesters, they're energized by this inauguration. The Republicans control both chambers of the U.S. Congress and now the White House as well as the Supreme Court. They feel that it's more important than ever for their side to have their voices heard through protest. So we see this as sort of the culmination tomorrow of a weekend of protest. They say it's just the beginning of 4 years of fighting this administration.
And it's unlikely, if people are wondering, it's unlikely that Hillary Clinton, for example, would show up. She attended, obviously, the inauguration. She attended the luncheon. She wasn't mentioned by name at the inauguration, even though she was sitting on stage. But at the luncheon, Donald Trump mentioned her and Bill Clinton and said that he had great respect for them, which was a shift in tone, a tremendous shift in tone from the campaign, but also more than some were expecting, of course. It's unlikely that she would make such a statement by showing up at a women's march, but some, at least on social media, have been asking her to do so.
It speaks to the way that this resistance, as it were, is now leaderless. Hillary Clinton lost this election. It's not sure if somebody like Bernie Sanders will emerge, newer, younger leaders in the Democratic Party and liberals in the United States, progressives, how that movement will shape up. A lot of it will have to do with what Donald Trump does as president and what can really grasp, I think, the imagination of that movement as well as a focal point moving forward.
I think you can hear one of the last bands coming through here, the parade route, as it finally passes the Trump Hotel and makes its way to the White House. It's been a lengthy parade. It's now after sunset. It was running about an hour behind. And I think one of the more interesting observations you had as we were speaking earlier, this is very different than previous inaugurations. There have been protests, but this clear sort of division between those who really like Trump and those who really don't like him. He has a favorable rating going into the White House of 40%. Barack Obama 8 years ago had a favorability of 80%. That is tremendous, and that was reflected in the signs that we saw here, in the thin turnout in the crowds, and in general in the tone of the conversation that we heard here.